All right. Welcome, everyone. Hope your post-lunch is, everyone's not going to fall asleep on me in the next, 30 minutes. Is that all right? I can see some of you guys are already losing it. All right, so this is performance for site builders. The goal here, you can't hear me? Okay. The goal here is really, performance is usually looked at as this kind of, it's left to the coders, it's left to the server guys, but ultimately 80+% of performance is really done by site builders, the original architecture of the Drupal site. So really my goal here is to kind of impart knowledge I've learned from actually being on the coding side to help site builders understand that you're actually maybe more important to that process than the actual developers doing the little tweaks at the end are. So we're going to step through a couple of things. You can't have a presentation without the introduction, of course, for me. We're going to look at evaluating modules, so really trying to understand when we're looking at a new module, what are we doing to actually figure out how it may or may not impact our site. What to look for in your site, so when you are having problems, how do you trace that back down to where the problem could have been coming from. We're going to look at the types of caching in Drupal. So this is probably the most technical piece in terms of how Drupal internally treats fields versus forms versus menus to try and get a good understanding of what you have control over, what you don't, and what you can really work on. And the last two are little tricks for configuring Drupal and other performance-related tools like certain Drupal modules or external services. Just really specific things that can help you in actually building the site. So the arbitrary introduction. I've been working at Acquia for about 3.5 years now. I focus almost entirely on performance, infrastructure, scalability. I am on that back-end side of things. But most weeks, as some of you guys know, I'm usually working with people actually building the sites. So I've been working with Drupal for, I guess, a little over 6 years now. And I've been a Linux administrator for 10+. So I've kind of seen both sides of that. Another arbitrary slide, I have to do it, I'm sorry. So here's some performance advice that if you're on Google, if you're on Stack Overflow, if you're looking on the internet, you've probably seen all of these at one point in time or another. Drupal's slow, you should be using this instead. Or it runs out of memory, so just keep giving it more and more and more, right? It works for a while, but it doesn't work forever. Don't use X module. Right, this is the one I love to see is don't use panels, it's slow. Right, don't use views, it's slow. Don't use this, it's slow. Most of them are complex because you can actually cache them more efficiently than something that's very simple. So in a lot of ways, using those bigger modules actually makes your life easier. Some other things like you need multiple servers. You should have a bunch of MySQL servers to handle all the queries that are coming out. You don't really need any of that. I mean, even for extremely large sites, the fastest query is the one you never run, right? So if you're caching, if you're doing that efficiently, that's going to make everything scale much better, and that's done through your configuration of Drupal. There's nothing in the database end that's going to stop that from happening. So let's just start off with looking at modules. So this is kind of my thought process of when I'm looking at a new module, what are my cues to knowing, is this going to be helpful on my site? Is this going to potentially cause performance problems? And how will I know this could be a problem later? So just looking generally, I mean, I'm sure most of you guys go through these types of steps. I look at the supported versions first. If it's not running on Drupal 7, that's pretty good indicators, can be hard to use. The second thing I usually look for is who the maintainers are. So this is something, if you're newer to the community, it's kind of hard to pick up on. But as you get farther and farther in and start seeing the same names over and over, this is what I look for long before I look at those usage numbers at the bottom of the screen. Because this is telling me that who wrote it is actually a good developer. Even if they're only using it for their one big high traffic site, I'll generally trust their code over someone's that's used on 1,000 really small, simple sites. So that's really my cue of, I don't know who this person is, what else have they done, look at just understanding how involved they are, and that's my biggest cue. These other ones I'm sure a lot of you guys are used to is the total usage, how many open issues there are, is this actually being taken care of? And lastly, I think a key one is a lot of people don't look at this chart, but how the usage changes over time. The total usage statistics are in the bottom of the module page, but if you actually click the link there that says view usage statistics, it actually breaks it down in this nice graph. So what it allows you to do is see, is this something that's becoming more popular or less popular or staying the same? And if you see two similar modules, one trending up and one trending down, that should be a good cue that this one's going in the right direction. So regardless of the numbers, the actual pattern is really important. So performance evaluation. I'm kind of going to repeat some of these themes throughout because they're really important. But before you add a new module, before you start adding new configuration, just get a really quick baseline of where it was before. Right? If you're not keeping track of each module as your site grows, you're going to get 100 modules in and have no idea where that breaking point actually happened. Right? It'll be a little slower, and then all those add up to the point that the site actually feels slow. But now you have 6 months of work to go back through. So it's really nice to have that accounting going on throughout the process. Also look at how memory is changing over time. So we'll get into just how to quickly look at memory and number of queries and those kind of things. But just see what it's doing, right? Did it trend up after a certain point in time? Just kind of see where these modules are actually, how they could be impacting the site. So this is the biggest thing when I'm working with clients to help them troubleshoot where they may be seeing problems. And I'm just going to say, if there's no other slide that you guys really absorb, this is the biggest one. Sorry it is so much text, but I figure it helps. This is how you figure out if your site's slow, how do you trace that back to which module's causing the problem? You know, just thinking about the problem from the perspective of what Drupal's actually doing. So when does this module actually run? Is it impacting user logins? Is it when a piece of content's being viewed? When a piece of content's being saved? Just think about the purpose of this module, and that will usually map very quickly to, it's slow when users log in. Okay, well most likely it's one of these 3 modules. And you've saved so much time from just taking that step to understanding when is it slow, not just getting the request says the site's slow, we need to work on that, right? Think about which pages it's affecting. How does this module scale? So as this grows out, is this something that latches onto every user account or every node or every taxonomy term? Or is this a global setting that really only exists in one place? You know, these are all kind of things you can extract from just a description of the module and just a really basic understanding of what it's doing. What happens is it fails, and how does that affect the site with performance? So this kind of goes into module evaluation. Is if it's a module you don't trust, think about how that could impact your site. If your site only has maybe a couple hundred nodes just of content, and that's really as deep as the content goes, if it's something that's impacting your site per node, there's not a huge amount of risk because it's simplified. If your site has tens of thousands of pieces of content, but 3 users, right, how you think about the gravity of those problems is going to change a lot. If it's impacting users, you don't really care in that case, but if it's impacting content, it's huge. So just kind of little cues to think about when you're going through this process. And lastly, do I really need this module? I mean, sometimes I'll go into clients 2 years into a process, and maybe 30% of what's on their site, they have no idea why it's there. Like, they can't point to anything on the site knowing what it's doing. So best case, it's not doing anything, but it's still there. Worst case, it's causing problems that you probably couldn't trace back because you didn't know it was being used. So always doing this inventory of knowing where things are at and where they're actually going. All right, so next, what to look for. So in the previous slide, we're looking at how does this module affect my site? Now we're going to look at how do we actually identify the problem so we can pretty simply map the two. Right? That's the goal here, is to do the legwork so that your troubleshooting is just memory, or it's just looking at a document. It's not troubleshooting the code and the database and all that stuff that's so complex no matter how accustomed you are to it. So let's think about when this problem actually happens. Right? So when does it occur? Similar to how the module works. Right? If a user's reporting a slow site, are they logged in yet? Are they still anonymous? That tells you a lot about what's happening. Are they creating content, just viewing it? What are they actually doing on the site where they're actually triggering this problem? Maybe it's something that you can actually verify on your own. Maybe it's something unique to them or their computer. Right? These are the kind of questions to ask at first. When did it start? This is one that everyone's going to say, well, the site's slow. Right? I'm sure that everyone's had that response at least a few times. But the site is slow doesn't mean it started today. It doesn't mean it was kind of slow last week, but it was tolerable, so you let it go and then it got worse. Right? It's really hard to know. So if you can just get a general sense of what week or month or when this started to happen, you can go back to that list that said, oh, this month we did this work, and that wasn't there the month before. So again, it's all just kind of talking to people, looking at what you've done. And last, who's to blame? I mean, ultimately, blame is kind of this dirty, nasty word, but guaranteed, no matter how much documentation you write, the person that built that is definitely going to know more about it than whatever that documentation said, if there was any. So when there is a new module, when there is a new feature, who did it, right? Was it a contractor that left? Was it someone you still can reach out to? Is it someone that still works here? Who actually did it? And then you can actually go through and figure it out. If you didn't know the module that's causing the problem, it's going to be really hard to figure out who enabled that because you don't even know how to ask that question, right? So just think about every time these actions are done and the site's growing, who's actually involved in that process, right? That could be an issue tracker, a document, whatever works for your team. But there's always the human element here. So looking at where problems most often occur is really what this is. So from my perspective, using Drupal for a long time, more often than not, these are the sources of the problems. So the biggest ones are what I'm calling page building modules. So essentially components you're building out on the site. Views, panels, context to some degree, display suite, all of those type candidates. Modules that are actually building out what you see on the site. Right? If it's something like views or panels that has a huge UI, the complexity of the UI is a good indicator for how complex the module actually is. So for something like panels or views with all those options, think about how much work the code has to do to actually figure out which one of those options to use. So there's a direct correlation there to how hard it is for you to use, how hard it is to use the interface, and what the code's ultimately doing. The second one is external web services. Are you logging in through LDAP? Are you pulling data from somewhere else? This is huge because the biggest thing is you have no control over it, right? This is something that you could set up 6 months ago, and all of a sudden today it got really bad, right? So these are sometimes harder to track down, but anytime you have an external web service, because you have that lack of control, make sure you know where that is. Is it user logins only? Is it just user registration? When is that happening? Because this is the one that views and panels will render eventually, take a few seconds maybe if it's slow. If it's an external web service and there's actually a problem with it, you'll see 30 seconds, 45 seconds. It'll be a lot more severe when something does go wrong. Overall complexity. So total number of modules, everyone always wants to ask, sorry?
Point out that if it's exactly 30 seconds, that's almost certainly a timeout that you're running into. You should be looking for an extra.
Right. So the comment is usually 30 seconds is a timeout value. So if it is exactly 30 or maybe even 60, if it's at a round number every time, it's going to be something external more than likely. Overall complexity. So everyone talks about how many modules is too many? Is 100 too many? Is 150 too many? Is 200 too many? In one of my clients' case, is 500 too many? That was fun. Well, their editors needed something, right? So they gave them everything just in case. But I've actually seen sites that were a view built inside of a mini panel, inside of another panel, inside of a context, and you start pulling all this out, and you go, I don't even know how to tune this site because I don't even know what's happening, right? You're so far into the weeds that you can't even optimize one thing without realizing you have 4 more layers, and you just go, all right, can we start over? Is Drupal 8 out yet, right? But these are kind of things when you're building the site, it's not hard to keep up with as you're building, but when you finally get to that end point of launching and you haven't thought about it, this does happen, right? Views inside of panels, inside of over and over and over. So just something to keep an eye on. There's no number here. There's nothing I can say that's 150 modules is your borderline. If you're above that, you're in danger. If you're below that, you're not. You could have a view inside of a panel without any problem. Maybe not inside of 4 more views or 4 more panels. But there is no single number that you can look at and say, all right, we need to stop. We need to pull back on the development. It's all about where things are trending and where it's changing over time. And lastly, misconfigured components. This is probably the most common, but it kind of applies to everything. So why not throw the rest of them out there first? Drupal is really built from the ground up to be good for developers and site builders to get a site out. I mean, I'm sure when you guys first started your Drupal sites, page caching's off, block caching's off, none of that's turned on by default, right? Your first reaction is always, wow, Drupal really is as slow as everyone says. You go, oh, it's not that slow. They just assume I'll do this later. So more often than not, panels, blocks, views, all of these things, they're going to run every time you look at them because Drupal is a developer-focused product. It's not necessarily focused at the final product from day one. So that's something to always think about, that you need to be proactive about what the performance is going to be. So how do we manage performance? And by manage performance, I mean over time, what are we actually looking for to know what performance is doing? And how do we know where it's finally fallen off? You know, keep records of performance. So again, we'll get to this in a second. So how many queries are there? How long is it taking? Using external services to say, today it was 2 seconds, a month ago it was a second and a half. Really looking at numbers. The best thing about performance is it's numerical. It's either slower or faster. It's pretty cut and dry typically what it's actually doing. If it's a little slower, you need to catch that because it'll eventually add up. Make sure that any of the milestones that you have, let's say you rolled out web services integration to your site. That's a hard milestone you should look at and go, oh yeah, that guy a long time ago told me web services are really bad for performance. I won't take offense if you don't remember my name, it's okay. And what is that is that actually impacting? Did the performance drop off at that point? Did it drop off a week before that, which means it wasn't web services at all? When is that actually changing? Establish a metric. So when you're looking at performance, when you're analyzing it, when are you done? You can always optimize more and more, but if you don't have that bar to know what's good enough, you're either never going to stop or you're never going to start because you have no relative value. So this is just kind of a decent one. 80% of pages should return in half a second and render in 3 seconds. Right? You can take that, look at some numbers and say, all right, my site's still good. Or my site's good most of the time, but it's not quite there. You know, this is something for the project management side, for the initial design of the site. What are those success metrics? What are you actually doing to know, is a site performant by our definition? Adopting a definition of done. So the idea being, if you don't put out a feature and check it off your list until it performs well, or until the security's there, whatever other items you're throwing into that list. If you complete something, but the performance is really bad, that's not completed, right? Ultimately, you're never going to come back and actually have the time to fix that later. So make sure you wrap that into your day-to-day small-term progress. And lastly, don't hide behind infrastructure. If you're in the great situation that you can just keep buying servers over and over and over and you don't have to worry about it, That's fantastic. You know, I envy you. But most of the time you don't have that option, right? You have a fixed amount of space, and that's what you have to make it work in. If Drupal's slow, it's going to consume whatever you give it, no matter how much you give it. If Drupal's fast, then it can work in whatever infrastructure you want. And it's going to be easier to get Drupal fast than just buy new hardware, right? So those are things you have control over. So there's 3 levels of caching as I look at it. I'm not sure how common these terms are or if it's just something I've thrown out there. But I break it down to 3 levels. Application level caching is things like the menu system. When I go to node/a number, how do I know where that actually goes? Right? Drupal's caching a lot of that, so it doesn't have to figure this out in a very slow way every single time. But from your perspective, you can't really touch that, right? It's either caching it or it's not. That's really all you can control. So the only thing you can really do here for performance is just making sure that it's working the way you think it should, and maybe using a different backend for it. So like Memcache, I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with. Maybe you can swap out the database and make the backend of the cache faster. You know, and that's a whole nother topic on its own, but at this level, it's nice to know it's there, and it's important to know what it's actually doing for you, but it's just that. It's just knowledge. There's not much you can really tune or play with here. So the next level up is component level caching, and this is really where you guys have the most control, the most granularity. This is blocks and views and panels, the day-to-day stuff you guys are doing. This is where component level caching comes in. So this varies depending on the module and how efficient it is. Like block caching in Drupal core, there's some issues with it, but the cache is just raw HTML. You can't really get much faster than go to the database, grab some HTML, and just stick it in the page. Right? That's very, very efficient caching. And most of those are just a matter of turning on or off. Views and panels are the same way. Views and panels have a lot of complexity out of the box, but the caching levels for them is very efficient. So if those are all turned on and used appropriately, you can get really far with just checkboxes and text fields, right? Those are your best friends for performance. So in this case, Drupal.org, if you think about this little module, I'm sure it's too small for most of you, but on Drupal.org, there's that little block on the front page that lists the number of modules, lists the number of themes. That seems like it'd be really expensive to do for every single person that visits Drupal.org, right? But is a module added every second? Is it added every minute? You don't have to regenerate this block all the time. So you can actually make sure that only every 10 minutes do you need this updated. And that makes a huge difference in performance. And those are really small things that you can focus on that don't take a whole lot of time and really a whole lot of kind of foresight to see what it could grow to.
Their caches.
It's recording still. Right.
It's still recording, yeah.
Right. The assist. Thank you. And kind of the last level is page level caching. This is another one that has a huge impact on the site, but realistically, the amount of control you have over it is mostly on or off with some sort of time frame. Right? And the big thing is if you're running an intranet or some sort of community site, all those people are logged in, so you can't really use this anyways. So as much as this will help you in general, I even look at it as less important than the component caching, because when your cache does clear, your page cache can clear out every single page individually, and that'll have to be regenerated. But if your views are really well optimized and you have the same view on 60% of your pages, you regenerate that once and 60% of your site is improved. So the page caching is one by one, but you really need to think about if I do lose the page cache, if that gets cleared out for whatever reason, if someone logs in, then what's your next line of defense? Right? You can't hide behind the page caching, even if it's an anonymous site, for a lot of different reasons. So now we'll look at some actual Drupal specific things. I'm sure some of you guys are thinking finally in the back of your head. So what kind of options can I set up in Drupal that will actually make my site faster, right? That's the goal here. So on the performance page is the biggest one. So using block caching. The block caching system in Drupal 7 and 6 has a lot of shortcomings, and that's a whole technical topic on itself, but essentially if you're using organic groups or taxonomy access control, you can't use block caching, right? There's a really hard switch there that there's some sites that can just never use it.
Say that again.
So if you're using organic groups, taxonomy access control, any access control module, you can't use block caching. It's kind of a hard, fast rule. But since block caching is the absolute most efficient caching you can do for logged in users, because as I mentioned, it's just raw HTML, it's great if you're not on one of those sites. So it's kind of tricky. If you're building a view, for instance, though, if that view is a block, you can cache the view. And even though you don't have block caching, you're still caching to some degree. So it's the most important thing to use, but it's not something you always have access to. Content changes in Drupal core. Sorry.
So if you're using organic groups, what's an alternative?
So if you're using organic groups, what's an alternative? The best example is if you're writing a view, cache the view. And then the container of the block around that view, it's not really costing you too much. So block caching is great because the block concept applies to just about everything. So it's really easy to kind of get it all at once. But there are cases where it just can't work. Again, that's a whole technical conversation on itself.
I just wanted to point out that if you use the PHP filter in your WYSIWYGs or your syntax format, that breaks caching.
Yeah. So the comment was there's PHP filter basically just disables output caching. So anytime you have a node, if you have PHP filter turned on, or block, yeah, any of that output caching is just disabled. So another reason not to use PHP filter.
Never use.
Spoken like someone that's been through a lot of pain.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
you know if like for some of the views they have a PHP default arguments or PHP evaluations, you know if that has the same effect?
I believe it does. I believe it blocks the views caching also.
Okay.
I think do you know?
Really good alternative to this block cache is block cache over.
Yep, just
Cache blocks versus one-third page, one-third wall.
It-
It's really granular.
Can you see my next slide from back there?
Oh.
I'm not sure. That'd be really impressive. We'll get to some of those. So another little thing, kind of, because Drupal's focused on developers to start with, every time you create a new piece of content or update one, your whole block and page cache goes away if it's inside of Drupal. So that's actually what this minimum cache lifetime, that's actually what that's essentially doing. Is if there's an action that wants to clear out the cache, for what duration are you essentially going to ignore that request? So if I update a piece of content, but I just built this view on the last request, I'll wait 5 more minutes to rebuild. So it prevents that kind of churning. If you're using a reverse proxy, a CDN, Varnish, other options out there, that's actually what the second value means. So these values look like they're really intimately related. They're really not. They actually serve completely different purposes. So this gets sent out to what that external page cache is, or even Drupal. This is more of a, how do I react when I do need to clear my cache? So again, it looks like a range or some sort, but they're really filling different purposes. And the last one, the bandwidth optimization, aggregating CSS, JavaScript, again, developer focused, making sure that that's on in production, off in your local environments. In your settings PHP, you can actually control those really easily. So for CSS, you can just set up a conf variable in there right under your database settings and the rest of that. right, Fast 404 is another one. 404 pages in Drupal, for any of you guys that have been around for, well, ever, 404s aren't the best things in Drupal. It looks at it, it sees that it's not available, whether it's a page or an image, and then it tries to figure out why, right? It tries to give you the benefit of the doubt and goes, he really knows what he's asking for. I must be wrong. I'll figure it out on my own. But that's really expensive. So Drupal now has this feature in core, and there's actually a separate contributed module that adds some more functionality. But the idea is, if I request a page that's .html, for instance, I know that's not Drupal. I can just cut it off there and return a 404. If it's an image file that is in a location where it should really exist, it'll say, no, I know that's not there, I'll stop now. So it just kind of short circuits that process, so the 404s aren't as bad. So a few other notes, just kind of laundry list style. Understand what Drupal does and doesn't cache. So actually the PHP filter is a good example of what impacts that. Do not enable UI modules on production. So rules, views, those, you don't really need them on production if you're using something like features. So it's just one more thing that Drupal has to worry about. And a big one is actually this last one. If you're getting a lot of PHP errors, let's say that you're moving old code to PHP 5.3 and now you're getting a whole bunch of warnings. Those errors, even if you're not printing them out, PHP is actually going through a whole routine where it says, that was an error, what should I do? What should I do? Oh, you didn't want me to print that out? Okay, well, I won't do anything. So it's actually constantly going through this process. Obviously, you could fix the errors. That's one thought. But if you're using database logging, these are the situations where the site can slow down really quickly. If you're using database logging and you're not printing out all these warnings, the site is probably still going to function well. But the second you get notices and warnings and all this stuff coming out, that database is going to slow down in a hurry.
So what you're saying is to just send them right to an error log and don't print them out?
So the question is, how do you get around this? Fixing them is probably the best answer. If you do have a lot of them, you can have the error log less on production, but make sure it's still high on like your staging environment so that you know it's still happening. And then you can always look at those logs, hopefully, and actually resolve them later. So now we'll actually get into the Drupal side of this. So Devel, this is the best way for you guys to figure out how long did this page take to generate, how many queries did it take, how much memory did it use, really kind of the trio of key performance numbers for Drupal. And it just puts at the bottom of the page, you can just read it from there, absorb it, write it down, really quick results. You can also print out all the queries you have. So if there is a slow query, you can actually see what those were. But I'd say more importantly, it's so that you can refresh a page, see what the performance is, write that down, and then you can move on and write it down the next time you enable a module. Boost is a great one for page caching, but it's really designed for flat files. So in shared hosting or environments where you don't have the luxury of things like Varnish or CDNs, that's really where Boost comes in. I look at it as infrastructure neutral because they're just files on a file system. So pretty much everything supports that. It's really good when you don't have that next level of caching options available to you. Memcache is another one that I mentioned for the application level caching that you don't really have control over. This is how you can speed up that backend. This requires a separate service to run on the infrastructure, so it may not be available to everyone. But this is a very common one and one that most people that have really set up a Drupal hosting environment probably have available for you. So a couple more modules. CDN's a great one for moving requests to other services. This could be a proper CDN. This could be a web server next to your main web server that's only handling asset requests. Really all CDN does is rewrite where it's going to get a request from. That's the magic it does. That's really the only goal there. But it is key because it allows your web servers to focus on Drupal and then all the images and everything else can come from somewhere else. Entity cache is great for Drupal 7, especially if you have really complex content types, lots of field collections, lots of fields. Every time you load a node, this basically takes a snapshot of it. So the next time you need that, it's already built for you. So this is one that I probably use on just about every site I use. There's very few side effects that I've ever seen, so I'd say it's pretty safe overall. Block cache alter was mentioned, so this allows you to actually look at your blocks and change the scope of how they're actually cached. So a lot of Drupal core blocks aren't even cached by default, but you have all these options hiding in there that you can use to cache on a global basis per user. You have a lot of different options there that Drupal just doesn't make evident to start with. So if you really know how the functionality is being used, this gives you a lot more control. A couple more modules more on the more advanced side of things. Views Light Pager. The actual work that Views does to build those little pagers, the page 1, page 2 arrows, is actually really expensive on very large sites. Or it potentially can be very expensive on very large sites. So what Views Light Pager does is it scales back the functionality. So essentially you just have a forward backward, but that actually can have really big performance implications. Views Content Cache and Cache Actions work in similar ways. The idea here is rather than me having a view that clears out every 5 minutes, what if I only update a piece of content once a day? Why would I regenerate every 5 minutes? That seems like a complete waste. What Views Content Cache and Cache Actions does is it says if I publish a new block, that's when I want to clear that cache. So rather than just some arbitrary time you pick, it's only cleared when it actually needs to be. And this is about as efficient of caching as you can get, because that could mean an hour, a day, a week, a year, right? Because it'll only regenerate when it actually needs to be, and it also prevents stale caches. So it takes a little more forethought, but it's kind of the epitome of where you want to get to. And the last one, cache expiration purge. It's a similar idea, but at a page level. So if I create a new piece of content, go out to Varnish and say clear out that page, or clear out these URLs from the page cache. It's just kind of a more macro level.
On the cache expiration, would that be integrated into Memcache also, or just only the Varnish side?
So cache expiration, so purge is what integrates with Varnish and Boost and those kind of tools. Cache expiration is kind of the mechanism for causing that. So cache expiration, I believe, can work. It does work with other page caching like Boost. I'm not positive about Memcache, but there's no reason it shouldn't, I suppose.
What about Redis?
Same idea. I'm not positive if exactly it does. Last one, the fastest module is one you don't install. So again, going back to, do you really need this? Or can you use some module you already have? Or do you really need the feature in the way exactly as you plan to build it? Right? This is just like queries. The fastest query is the one you never make. The fastest module is the one you never install. The smaller you keep your site, the more maintainable it'll be forever, essentially. And lastly, I want to throw out some kind of third-party tools that are out there. And I just want to highlight a couple of really clever, simple ones. Webpagetest.org is an invaluable tool. You basically just put in a URL and it gives you the performance of it, the breakdown of basically what Firebug does of the page, all the assets, kind of shows you that full waterfall. But the idea is it's coming from outside. So if you're working locally with the site, it'll be a lot faster than what the real user's seeing. So web page test is a great simple example. Other ones like Why Slow or Google PageSpeed, those will give you a great little checklist to say, why is the front end of my site slow? Do I have too many JavaScript? Do I have too much CSS? It allows you to kind of have a voice that'll actually reason and tell you where the problem may be. So I want to hopefully leave a few more minutes for questions. if you have any, if I don't get to as many questions as I'd like, feel free to reach out to me on anywhere. If you can see a pattern, my username is typically the same in a lot of places. It's really hard to remember. These slides are on SlideShare. I just uploaded them before this, so for all you guys taking pictures, feel free to go look at the hi-fi versions. So do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I came in a few minutes late, so I covered it, but
So did I, sorry.
is there anything that you could recommend as far as Devel's great for going, just like looking at how a query state kind of thing, that's like down the line, what everything took to execute internally. But is there anything that you could recommend that you can install that's like you could visually review and show stakeholders or developers that shows bottlenecks, identifies bottlenecks in your bootstrap?
So the question was, something like Devel is great for developers, but basically how do you sell that performance issue to non-technical people? Is that a fair rephrasing?
Yeah, just like something like green, yellow, red.
Right.
This module is really throwing a log jam.
So that's what tools like New Relic or Yoda can do.
Yeah.
So New Relic will actually look at the PHP side of it to actually say these are the functions that are slowest, these are queries that are slowest. Yoda will actually look at it kind of from the front end side of which JavaScript is the slowest. So these two kind of paired together. New Relic has a lot of that front end stuff now, but those types of tools are built for here's a report that you can send to other people. Right. Devel is, I mean, just like most Drupal modules, visually it does kind of the bare minimum.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of New Relic. I was still wondering if there's anything, again, you have to get somebody signing up for that.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any modules that you're aware of that just kind of look like that.
So one that goes a little bit farther is, are you familiar with XHProf?
Yeah.
So XHProf, again, visually, not quite stunning. There's actually an alternative front end for it called XHGUI. If you just search for it, you'll find it eventually. But the idea is it actually aggregates all that XHProf data into graphs, into aggregates, into averages, so that it's something that still needs context around visually what it's saying, but it's doing a lot of the math that New Relic would be doing, but you can do it locally, free, easy to set up type world.
Is there any part of the
No, go ahead, sorry.
Is there any part of the conventional wisdom for Drupal site optimization that you think is actually wrong? Because everything you said is very reasonably straightforward, but is there anything out there that you think actually a lot of people do to optimize the Drupal site is actually wrong?
So the question is, what do I think is there any common optimizations that I think are bad practice? I think having MySQL slave servers is one good example of when Drupal 7 came out. I remember everyone was so excited about that feature. If you're in the 1% of sites that even could possibly want to use that, you're probably running your own Drupal core patches and your own things in there. So now that it's so easy to do, I see a lot of people do it, and it can cause problems that they don't really understand.
Can you repeat what you're referring to?
So MySQL slaves is so in Drupal 6, it was always one MySQL server. Drupal 7 added the feature so that you can actually split some of the queries to multiple MySQL servers. But the dirty little secret is Drupal core doesn't use it. And any explicit code you write or views, you have to tell it to actually use that server. So I've seen countless setups where they set up a whole bunch of extra MySQL servers and they don't understand why they're not even in use. Because the feature is there, but again, it's built so that you have to be proactive about improving that performance. Trying to think of any other good examples. I'll pass. I'll think about that one. Sorry.
That's awesome.
Actually, I'll go someone else if you don't mind. I'll go over you. Green shirt.
My question is, are there any caching techniques that conflict with one another? For example, on your ABC caching with map caching with loggers that conflict, for example?
So the question is, are there any caching backends that conflict with one another? APC kind of conflicts with itself. So APC runs only on a single server. So if you have two servers, it's going to conflict with itself. I'm sorry?
Two Drupal instances on the same server.
No, opposite. The same Drupal instance was split between two servers. If you're using APC, like the APC module, it'll store a local copy on both servers, which is a little funky. Another one that I've seen where I'm not sure it's a conflict, but it's something I've run into a lot, is if you do have varnish on the front end, but you have just the normal page caching in Drupal, you're actually going to have a saved page cache in Drupal. So even if you clear varnish, you can actually end up serving a cache page from inside of Drupal. So there's different ways to get around that. You can change the cache back into the form cache to either the varnish cache, or Drupal core has a fake cache. I think that's something like that, which basically means don't do anything. And the idea is any cached object you want in one place so that you don't have multiple copies and it's hard to troubleshoot. And that's actually a case where I've seen having a separate page cache out front and still leaving the Drupal page cache just kind of at defaults can actually cause some tricks.
You said entity cache. You said entity cache is kind of the de facto model to turn on. Are you using that with memcache to store, or to use backend bins for memcache, or are you leaving that in the database?
So the question is what backend to use for entity cache? Because of the type of work entity cache is doing, it's basically just saving you from regenerating that object. That's really the big gain. If it's in the database, you'll still get a gain from it. If it's in memcache, you may get a slightly better gain. But because it's saving so much processing time, you kind of want to look at those as two different questions, right? It's how can I improve the performance of my site, and then how can I eke out a little bit more? So actually memcache, I would say, for the guy in the back, that's one that I think is great for a lot of sites, but if you're running a simple site, it's not really a have to have. I think that's actually a good example.
So we're using memcache, but sometimes there's questions or problems of whether using a particular cache is memcache or the database. So whether it's memcache.
I don't think entity cache really falls into that either or. So that's my time. I know there's some more questions, so I'll answer the rest of them up here if you guys are still interested. So yeah, thanks everyone.